Last time we spoke, the death of Nehachi led to the rise of his grandson Hong Taiji. The Sea King Mao Weilong was finally caught lying about his military achievements and even secretly negotiating with the Jin. Mao's rival, Yuan Chonghuan, took little time to get rid of Mao, thus ridding himself of the man stealing all of his limelight. Unfortunately, it was not too long when Yuan would fall victim to a sneaky ploy of Huang Taiji, who was executed under the false pretense that he was a turncoat, much like Mao. Huang managed to get some very valuable Ming defectors and upgraded his military with new cannons and naval units. Then Huang proclaimed his people to be the Manchu under a brand new Qing dynasty as he tried to conquer all of Korea. With the Koreans now giving him tribute, he soon turned his gaze back towards the Ming, with some new toys in hand. This episode is the rebellion of Li Zicheng. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if after all that you were still hungry for some more History of Asia related content, why don't you check my personal channel out at the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I cover the history of China during the 1800s all the way to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Check it out, it means a lot to me. In early 1634, one man, Chen Qiyu, was installed with some incredible amounts of power. He was made supreme commander of Shanxi, Henan, Huguang, and Sichuan. The Ming Court had realized the required authority necessary to coordinate operations against the wandering bandit menace. Droughts, famine, and even cannibalism was seen all over, driving peasants to swell the ranks of the bandits who soon became full-on rebel armies. So many officials in numerous provinces complained they lacked the resources necessary to feed their troops, distribute relief, or quell rebellions. In turn, when they would fail, they would be dismissed, leading to a further shortage of competent men to manage the terrible situation. In the area between Shanxi and Hunan, over 200,000 rebels began taking smaller towns and killing local officials. The rebels would routinely attack smaller towns, usually in groups of about 10,000, and perform atrocities against the officials there. They would avoid any open battles with Ming forces, always being on the move. Then, all the prominent rebel leaders got together for a grand meeting, which would be a rather dramatic turning point. The overarching leader amongst them was Li Zicheng, who would make many key decisions for them all. The most successful of these groups would be the rebel leaders Zhang Xianzhong and Gao Yingxian, who hit Nanjili. En route to their target, their troops carried around banners declaring themselves followers of the true primal dragon emperor, and thus they were identifying themselves as something more than just mere bandits. They marched through Hunan on their way into Nanjili, looting the town of Fengyang. There, they killed over 4,000 Ming officials and civilians, performing some heinous atrocities, some stating that they even ripped fetuses out of pregnant women. They razed everything to the ground and looted the place for days. Once they were done, Gao headed west and Zhang went east to attack Luzhou. Defending Luzhou was the commander Wu Dapo, who deployed peasants and troops to try and defend the town. He set up cannons atop walls and stockpiled large logs to be thrown at the rebels. Then the bandits got close. His forces opened fire, killing around 1,000 of them. Yet such local competent commanders were increasingly becoming rare, and the emperor continuously resorted to dispatching eunuchs wherever he could to resolve matters. These eunuchs, of course, were not military men, and many had ulterior motives. The bandits were moving further south, freaking out the Ming Court, and that of the emperor. Drastic measures were enforced, such as rushing 43,000 troops from other theaters, such as that from the northeast, where the Ching could strike at any moment. In the wake of the absolute disaster at Fengyang, Hong Cheng-cho was given the task to crush the rebels within 6 months' time, and the emperor followed this up by pledging almost 1,000,000 taels worth of supplies for the task. Despite all these major efforts, Hong had far too few troops, too much ground to cover, and far little time. The rebels roamed freely, prompting one official in Hunan to state, "The villages are bare of people. White bones fill the wilderness, and at night the crying of ghosts can be heard everywhere." Rice inflation was so high, it is alleged people were buying human flesh of the deceased in markets. The rebel groups were demonstrating more and more tactical awareness. They began burning crops in certain areas to deny food supplies to the pursuing Ming forces. Gao Yingxian besieged Guangzhou with a force of possibly 70,000, and he used many heavy cannons. Gao followed this up by attacking Taozhou, dangerously close to the secondary capital of the Ming, Nanjing. His forces would crush a Ming army in Song and Hunan before he returned to Shaanxi in 1636. The rebels and Ming officials would go back and forth with countless battles, and one Ming official realized the rebellions now needed to be quelled as a first priority. The Minister of War, Yang Sichang, stated the rebels were, quote, "a disease of the heart." And he argued that the capital region must be protected from the spreading poison of the rebels. The frontier war with the Manchu he deemed to be a, quote, "like the arms of a person, not necessary for survival, but the heart was." Yang saw the greatest danger being in Shaanxi, Hunan, Huguang, and Qingbei. He thought the empire required a bold new strategy to restore state control of the Central Plains. Once this was achieved, they then could turn their attention towards the Manchu threat. Yang's plan was to become known as Shiyan Jiwang, the 10-sided net. Like most grand proposals during this time, it looked amazing on paper and would become a catastrophic failure. By 1637, the scope of the rebellions had expanded greatly, and the center of its activity was shifting from the south and east closer to the capital and the agricultural heartland of the Ming dynasty. This Yang prescribed the construction of more defenses along the frontier, hoping to bolster everything aside from troops. He wanted to keep around just 50,000 troops outside the Great Wall, thinking it would be a sufficient deterrent against the Manchu. The idea was, if 50,000 were attacked by Manchu invaders, they could buy enough time for reinforcements to rush in. In the meantime, they could even open up peace talks with the Manchu simply to buy more time for what was really needed to be done: quell the rebellions once and for all. There was quite an uproar in the Ming Court over the idea of opening peace talks with the Manchu, but it would be begrudgingly done. Some others in the court advised opening up trade markets with their Mongol allies to procure horses, hoping to drive a wedge between the Manchu and their Mongol allies. Ming intelligence at the time suggested the Mongolia frontier situation was a hotspot, not just between the Ming and the Manchu, but also between the Manchu and certain Mongol groups. The idea, as stated by one official, was, quote, "to use barbarians to control barbarians." Yang believed, given adequate supplies, How many times have I stated that one at this point? Given adequate supplies, the soldiers could be fed and would fight, and in turn would be able to depend on the populace accordingly. Once the populace felt safe, they would direct their allegiance to the Ming government and be less inclined to join the rebel groups. Then, with the populace, they could form militias and finally cut off, isolate, and starve out the rebel groups. Yang then prescribed punishment and even execution for Ming officials who were derelict in their duties. This was the 10-sided net strategy. Yang said Shaanxi, Hunan, Huguang, and Jiangbei would have 4 lines of defense, each with a pacification commissioner assigned. At Yansui, Shaanxi, Shandong, Jiangnan, Jiangxi, and Sichuan, there would be 6 auxiliary lines of defense, each also assigned pacification commissioners as well. Those commissioners would be directing both defensive and offensive operations. Through their efforts, they would gradually close in around the rebel positions until they were all trapped, then killed or captured. Defense was the primary function of it all. Once the net closed in on the rebels, the Mings would employ clearing the fields and strengthening the walls as a general strategy. Thus, with heavily defended cities and no supplies available to them, the rebels would eventually be forced to surrender. 2 supreme commanders, the Zhongli and Zhongdu, would smash the enemy wherever possible, while the rest of the officials would act more locally. The Zhongli and Zhongdu's troops would be elite troops with better mobility. Yang estimated they would need 10,000 troops in key defensive posts and around 30,000 for each supreme commander. In total, they would require 120,000 troops, of which 36,000 would be mounted. Overall, the problem should be resolved in a matter of 6 months, to be sure. Now, to equip and supply all of these troops, it was estimated to cost 2.8 million taels. How are they going to pay for all of this? Taxes, taxes, taxes. Yang argued they could increase the land tax by about 12 ounces of grain to bring in an extra 1.9 million taels, and get another 400,000 via special taxes on surplus lands. 200,000 from postal revenues, and the rest perhaps by raising the sales tax just a bit. There was a ton of debate in the Ming Court over all of this, but Yang got his way. The plan was a go, though it certainly had its critics. One major critic against Yang and his plan was Sun Chongqing, the Grand Coordinator of Shaanxi. Sun argued countless problems with the 10-sided net plan. First, he argued the funds and manpower for it were highly unrealistic, stating, quote, "How can the state raise an extra 2.8 million taels when they're already spending more than 1 million taels in extra revenues?" Sun reiterated this argument, asking where the troops would even come from, and how the hell would he manage to do all of this in just 6 months? Sun also stated the seasons when this would all take place were not the same seasons the bandits usually were at large. There was also the issue of terrain. The rebels could still flee into the mountains and the forests, which large Ming armies would lose them in. Sun said many more troops would actually be required for this plan, and those officials appointed needed not only to be competent, but they also needed to be very knowledgeable at the local levels. Sun characterized the plan to be more of a empty net strategy. How cheeky. But like most critics, hell, the majority of our politicians today to boot, Sun had no alternative plan. I am sure any of you in the audience can already see one of the largest issues with this plan, that of taxation. The peasants are rebelling because there is no food or funds in their regions, so the plan is to further tax them to stop them from rebelling. This issue did not go unnoticed. The emperor himself stated, "Leadership and money needs to come from the gentry, not the masses. Suppressing the bandits requires a big campaign, which requires lots of troops. The money can't come from the people, but should come from the treasury. But the treasury is empty. Shong Wenkan, a man who gained a reputation for quelling rebels, was appointed as one of the supreme commanders, alongside Hong Chengqiao. Out in the field, Xiong and Hong managed to achieve many victories against the rebels. Hong even managed to defeat Li Zicheng, one of the biggest rebel leaders at large. But these victories did not amount to peace for the populace. Many of the pacification armies would loot and rape as they drove the rebels into the mountains. As is expected, Ming commanders would not venture too deep into those mountains, fearing rebel ambushes. Ming forces won numerous battles, claiming the lives of thousands of rebels, but were never able to eliminate the enemy entirely from any given region. At one point, the rebel leader, Jiang Xianzhong, was defeated in battle, and he had to surrender. This prompted some Ming officials to discuss the idea of using Jiang Xianzhong to kill the other rebel leaders. Most officials deemed the idea completely insane, and it was soon disregarded. While the discussions were going on, however, Shong Wenkan allegedly gave Jiang 20,000 men to help maintain local order. This eye-opening moment prompted Yang Sichang to become much more personally involved in the campaign, not liking how his subordinates were simply doing things on their own, and some not even following direct orders. Yang also vowed to the emperor it would all be done by the winter of 1638. Yang then berated field commanders to obey the authority of the Ming officials. Winter of 1638 came, with no significant results, and Yang asked the emperor to replace him, but this was refused. This prompted Yang to make a list of officials who he deemed deserved punishment for lack of action during the campaign. One of the most notable was Hong Chengqiao, who seemed to be making no ground. Many officials were punished, except for Hong, who the emperor personally liked and protected. There were many unforeseen problems, such as local officials hiding resources and bribing tax agents who came looking for funds. Natural disasters plagued China as well. Locust plagues hit and caused more famines in Henan, Suzhou, and Shandong, forcing more and more peasants to scrounge for food, and then many earthquakes hit Sichuan. More and more, the strong joined the rebels, and the weak starved to death. Yang himself seemed to not even be following the 10-sided net strategy anymore by 1638. Yang began to prioritize certain regions over others, rather than keeping the net closing around overall, and when the emperor questioned him, Yang would argue it was too difficult to coordinate the other officials. As I have already mentioned, many of the sub-commanders and other officials were beginning to not heed orders, and it was becoming a noticeable problem. And of course, Yang gave the age-old excuse, lack of troops, lack of supplies speech, as usual. All in all, the rebels were certainly being killed or captured. Many of their leaders were falling. It's not like the Ming were not making headway. Yang was even beginning to feel some confidence that the plan was working, and he proposed grabbing another 1,000,000 taels for the plan and famine relief. Then, a disaster would strike. As I had previously mentioned, part of the plan was to open up peace talks with the Ching, to bide more time to finish off the rebels. In 1638, the Ming were not looking so good, and the Manchus were coming off multiple war victories, making them not too willing to talk about peace. Some in the Ming Court thought they should negotiate making Huang Taiji a tributary prince. Yang Sichang pushed for this heavily. Yuan Chongjin held a meeting with many officials over the state of the frontier defenses. They lacked firepower, and many competent commanders were busy with the rebels. In the end, as a result of the circumstances, the emperor ruled in favor of offering to make Huang Taiji a tributary prince. Meanwhile, Qing nobles such as Duoguan, Kong, Geng, and Shang began raiding Ming territory outside the Great Wall. Then Doraguan had a lucky encounter at a large redoubt near the Great Wall, and he annihilated the force in it and proceeded across the border and approached the Yellow River. Zhu Dashao alerted the capital and demanded relief forces to rush over. The Ming Court debated on what action to take. Yang Sichang advocated for negotiations, while others urged for battle. One commander, Lu Xiangsheng, argued with Yang, "If you discard war, but talk of negotiations, you nourish disaster and bring disgrace to the country. Who doesn't know this? What's the point of my receiving the double-edged sword from the emperor if I don't exert myself in battle?" Yang's rebuttal to this was to sneakily transfer troops from Lu Xiangsheng to another commander named Gao Zitian, leaving Lu with only 20,000 men. The emperor, for his part, was outraged by the Qing threat to his capital yet again and yelled at Yang in front of the entire court. It seemed the emperor was most angry about the idea that those around him thought he personally believed peace talks were the best choice of action, as he did not himself think so. The emperor then ordered Lu Xiangsheng to pursue the enemy and for Gao Zitian to defend Shanhaiguan. The emperor sent 40,000 taels to Lu as a reward and stated, "Peace talks were the idea of the outer court officials. The emperor personally favors war." The Qing attacked Gaoyang, where the now 76-year-old and retired Sun Chengzang was. He, alongside his whole family, participated in the defense of the city. The city fell after 3 days, and poor Sun Chengzang and 19 of his family members perished. Lu Xiangsheng pushed for a counterattack, but Gao Zitian argued they would be better to take defensive positions. Lu's forces were fighting the enemy at Baoding, but they had no rations left. Lu pleaded with his men to continue fighting, stating, "You and I have received the blessings of the state. In this calamity we may not avoid death, but there is no calamity in which we might not attain life." His men resolved to fight on, to delay the enemy, preparing for relief forces to come. Gao's forces were only 15 miles away when they received a plea from Lu to come help. But Gao did not reply. Lu's forces were surrounded near the Gaoshui Bridge outside Jianzhuang. Then they engaged the enemy. The battle lasted 6 hours, with cannons, guns, and arrows flying all about. Lu's subcommanders pleaded to try and break out of the encirclement, but Lu demanded they all make a last stand. Lu would die from 4 arrows and 3 sword blows, allegedly taking 10 men down with him. The Qing took Changping, Xijiao, and Pinggu, and even reached the outskirts of Jinan by January of 1639. Jingyan City would fall and be razed to the ground, and the Ming prince, Zhang Bingwen, would die from arrow fire and street fighting as the defenders fled for their lives. Doraguan then raided some territory around Tianjin before heading back east. By the time any significant Ming relief forces came down to bear on the Qing, they were already making a withdrawal. The Qing raids had lasted 5 months. They hit 53 cities, of which they captured 8. They fought 57 battles, defeating 33 Ming divisions and captured an incredible 473,000 Ming, 4,000 taels of gold, and nearly 1,000,000 taels of silver. Over 100 Ming officers were killed, and sadly, 150,000 civilians would lose their lives. The Ming Court responded first with the execution of 32 officials, deemed to have allowed the situation to get out of hand. Yang Sicheng was impeached, but managed to avoid execution. Competent commanders who were quelling the rebels were transferred to the northeast to prepare new defenses against future Qing attacks, leaving the northwest to fester with more rebellions. A little while back, I mentioned the talk of using the surrendered rebel leader Zhang Xianzhong to help kill other rebel leaders. Well, this whole time he was in Luch Chung, training a so-called militia and making promises to the Ming Court that he would help pacify all of Huguang. He had erected custom houses on the Han River to collect transit taxes, under the guise they were to help defend Guchang. He was also bribing officials and local administrators left, right, and center, effectively having them firmly under his thumb. Meanwhile, Song Wenkan was still performing offensive operations against the rebels, while the Ming Court in late 1638 falsely believed the rebels were largely quelled. Then Jiang Xianzhong, to the surprise of absolutely no one, began rebelling with the so-called militia group he had been training. It should come to no surprise at all, Jiang's efforts the whole time were in preparation for future rebelling. He had extorted money through the transit tax schemes and used the funds to reinforce the walls of the town where he settled his garrison. On top of bribing so many officials to turn a blind eye to his actions, upon recommencing with the rebellion, he sent a release of records of all the corrupt officials who dealt with him and made them public, leading to more and more executions. Jiang's force joined up with another rebel leader's force named Le Rukai, and they soon began to attack Fangxian, which fought them for over a week before its gates were finally opened. The rebels plundered Fangxian, and then they casually moved into the mountains near the Shaanxi border. The man who had captured Jiang in the first place, Song Wenkan, was berated for all of this, of course. Shang sent Zhou Liangyu to pursue the rebels, but Zhou's force were ambushed in the mountains, taking 10,000 casualties, forcing them to retreat. It was one of the greatest rebel victories at that point. They had not only killed a large number of Ming soldiers, their force had also got their hands on a ton of war supplies, and Zhou's official seals of authority. The disgraced and severely deranked Yang Sichang demanded to be allowed to deal with the problem, and he was reappointed Minister of War, Grand Secretary, Supreme Commander of Bandit Pacification, and bestowed the double-edged sword of authority in 1639. Wow, that was like the kitchen sink of appointments. The emperor agreed to give Yang 5 million taels to wipe the rebels out once and for all, and pretty much gave him carte blanche for how to operate. Apparently, the emperor even personally served Yang wine at a later banquet and gave him a handwritten poem. Talk about your fall and rise moments. Shang was impeached, of course, for his incompetence and even being accused of taking bribes from Jiang Xianzhong. Yang had a 6-step plan now to stop the spread of the rebels. First, taxes would be used to raise local troops with military farms established to feed them. Second, town walls would be improved. Third, mercenaries would be hired to help train local militias. Fourth, all cities would have firearms mounted on their walls. Fifth, the government needed to improve famine relief efforts. And sixth, they needed river forces to stop rebel boats and advocated for bringing troops from neighboring regions to help encircle the rebels. As you can imagine, the funding for all of this came from what else but taxes. Boy, I sound like an angry conservative in the United States. Surprisingly, Zhou Liangyu was appointed bandit pacifying general despite his enormous defeat to Jiang. Zhou from the offset would also believe he was being held back by Yang, who kept him in a defensive position and denied him any opportunity to get revenge upon Jiang. Despite the efforts, the rebels remained on the rise. Now Lo Rukai and Jiang Xianzhong commanded a force of 100,000 by the fall of 1639. Yang decided to surround Jiang's stronghold of Guchang, as Chongjin berated him, demanding to know how long this would all take. Throughout 1639 to 1640, the Ming seemed to be piling up victories over the rebels, and even Jiang Xianzhong had fled into Sichuan, being pursued by a very angry Zhou Liangyu. Yang ordered Zhou to stop pursuing him, but Zhou ignored the order and managed to encircle Jiang near Mount Manao. There he made a major victory, inflicting 3,500 casualties, capturing several commanders, and also Jiang's wives and concubines. Zhou seemingly exonerated himself, but Zhang managed to escape further west into Sichuan. Not to mention, Yang was not too happy he disobeyed orders. Yang, as was typical of Ming officials, sought to limit those he saw as rising rivals, such as Zhou. So Yang recommended another general, He Renlong, to be invested with Zhou's title, which would prove to be a serious mistake. Yang's recommendation fell dead, and, well, now he had alienated both Zhou and He. Zhou then turned to pursue Zhang, who was beginning a rampage throughout Sichuan. Many Ming soldiers began deserting at this time, prompting Yang to become more desperate and perform such acts as recruiting Shaolin monks at a temple in Hunan. Soon all of Sichuan was in trouble, as tons of cities were taken by the rebels or simply abandoned. Famines forced peasants to cannibalism, and thus many more joined the rebels. Soon Yang yet again asked to be relieved of his post, but the emperor responded by sending 200,000 taels for famine relief instead. Now, because of Yang's strategy to coordinate regional defenses, many local communities were left largely to fend for themselves against the wandering rebels. Zhang and Luo's combined forces struck several cities in Sichuan. Yang was pushed to relocate his HQ to Changqing, where he could be a little bit closer to the fighting. He then began to place a bounty on Zhang's head and announced clemency for other rebels if they simply brought him Zhang's head. To make matters even worse, the Ming Court increasingly became frustrated with Yang's inability to achieve results and his numerous disputes with his subordinates whom were all rallying against him, stating that he was incompetent and that he should be replaced. To all of this, Zhang Xianzhong wrote a poem mocking Yang. Before we had a coordinator, Shao, who often came forth and danced with me. Then came the armies, who would not fight, but followed me around. But now we have a good commander, Yang, who graciously leaves me a 3-day road. The rebels took Luzhou in December of 1640 and fled at the first sight of Ming troops trying to encircle them. Yang was desperate, and he ordered all of his commanders to assemble at Yuanyang and to mount one more campaign to crush the rebels once and for all. How many times have I said once and for all at this point? Well, yet by this point, many of the commanders were simply ignoring Yang's orders. For example, Zhou Liangyu headed east, trying to stop rebels from escaping into Shaanxi. He Renlong went west, doing a similar operation. Yang was lashing out at his commanders, whom argued with him that with so much terrain to cover, it was simply better to go in the offense than the defense now. Then Yang's fears were realized when Zhang Xianzhong managed to capture Ming Prince Xiang at Xianyang. Zhang's men had plundered some seals of office from Ming forces and used them to get into the town. Now Zhang occupied the prince's seat in his palace. Zhang allegedly poured the prince some wine at the palace and demanded of Xiang, "I wish to have the head of Yang Sichang, but he is far away in Leikou, so now I'll have to borrow the prince's head in his stead. This will cause Sichang to suffer the full penalty of the law for having lost his princely fief. Now the prince should use all his strength to finish his wine." Zhang then tied Prince Xiang to the palace wall and lit him and his concubines on fire. Zhang then distributed some 150,000 taels from the prince's treasury to the people. But it should be noted his men had performed horrible atrocities upon the people as well. They cut several hands off, feet, ears, and noses from random civilians as they captured towns in the area. I literally have written an entire episode on Zhang Xianzhong, and I think I've already said it. It is the stuff of nightmares what this guy and his forces will do. I mean, I have read some really rough stuff, like the book, let's say, The Knights of Bushido, a book exclusively on war crimes performed by the Imperial Japanese troops during World War II, and that has nothing on this guy. Anyways, now the rebel army moved east, taking even more towns, even Guangzhou. Upon hearing the news, Yang was livid with his commanders, who all defended themselves, stating they were guarding against raids from Li Zicheng's rebel army in the north. To add insult to injury, Li Zicheng's forces did strike from the north, hitting Luoyang, and he managed to capture the extraordinarily fat Prince Fu and his grandson. By contemporary accounts, it's estimated Prince Fu may have been something like 400 pounds, and he was quite reviled by the local populace. Prince Fu kowtowed before Li, begging for his life. Li, of course, killed him, and then distributed a lot of his wealth to the people of Liaoyang, stating to them, "The prince and the wealthy stripped away the flesh of the people, and had no regard for the life and death of the common folk. I've killed him on your behalf." Allegedly, Li and his sub-commanders then stripped flesh from Prince Fu and consumed it with wine as a cruel pun. For taking Liaoyang, Li became the foremost rebel leader, and the term dashing prince began to be associated with him. Luch similarly held the title Generalissimo, chosen by heaven to pacify the people. Yang fell into despair, believing all was now lost, and he sent a letter to the emperor asking for his own execution. Yang eventually stopped eating, and he died in March of 1641. Yeesh. Jiang Xianzhong would later capture Yang's ancestral home of Wuling, dig up his grave, and desecrate Yang's corpse. Yang's demise truly illustrates the many problems of the late Ming politics and military situation. All too often, sweeping authority was bestowed on civil officials who lacked military experience. The 10-sided net strategy was doomed from the very beginning. The main problem with it was that of resource allocation. If perhaps the Manchu threat had been contained in the northeast, then maybe Yang could have mustered the forces and resources necessary to beat back the rebels. But the entire time, there was a fight over resources between the Manchu problem and the rebel problem. And many court officials did not know which one was the largest threat. The numerous natural disasters that led to wide-scale famines did not help at all, and were only made worse by Yang's lack of military experience. While the Ming forces pretty much always bested the rebels during battle, the rebels enjoyed superior mobility and easily disappeared when needed. For the remainder of 1641, the Ming tried to fight off the rebels in central China. Ding Jie replaced Yang Sichang, and Fu Zonglong was appointed Vice Minister of War and Supreme Commander of Shaanxi. Li Zicheng had risen to be the most powerful rebel leader, with Jiang Xianzhong and Luch beneath him, but all held significant reputations and status. As a result of all the battles to destroy the rebels, now the rebels had earned significant battle experience, technological expertise, and a ton of weapons were captured. The Ming were losing their technological edge in the war against the rebels. After the Ching raid in Shandong, the Ching launched a probe attack on Songshan in March of 1639. A Qing force of 30,000 approached Songshan, where they were met with 37 heavy cannons, which repulsed them quite quickly. Huang realized the Ming were not ready to abandon their defenses outside the Great Wall so easily. Plans for defending the Liaodong region continued, but at this point, Ming officials feared to advance any plan of war, in fear of failing and being punished for it. It goes without saying, the emperor's temper was pretty high at this point, and one was likely to be executed or at least lost significant status for such ventures if they did not pan out. As the war against the rebels intensified in western and central China, the Qing began to make more noise in Liaodong. Ningyuan remained a thorn in Huang Daiji's side alongside Songshan and Jinzhou for over a decade now. Since early 1640, the Qing began setting up military farms in preparation for future attacks on Ming territory. The Joseon dynasty was now also helping the war effort by sending food supplies by ship to Xiaolinghe and Dalinghe. Many war plans were brought to Huang by his commanders, and eventually one would be approved. The plan was to capture Songshan and Jinzhou, which were thought to be the key to taking Shanhaiguan. The war planners argued that previous raids had failed against Songshan and Qizhou because the Ming held the Shanhai-San-Qin corridor. But if that was severed, the Qing could consolidate all of Liaodong and then hit China proper. Now the Ming were not sitting by idly. They saw the Qing build up and knew a massive invasion was coming. The Ming also rightfully deduced an attack would be made on Xiangshan and Qinzhou, so both were heavily fortified and prepared for sieges. The Qing first made their attack on Jingzhou in May of 1640. The Qing began to dig trenches around the city, preparing for a very long siege. By March of 1641, Zhu Dashao sent a messenger outside the walls of Jingzhou, stating to the Qing forces, "We've got food to last 2 to 3 years. It will be a long siege. Will you be able to hold out that long to outlast us?" The Qing replied, "We aren't lifting the siege. Whether it lasts 2 to 3 or even 4 to 5 years, how are you going to keep getting food?" The back and forth talk seemed to unsettle the Ming's Mongol allies at Xinzhou, who began to negotiate with the Qing separately. This drove Zhu to panic somewhat and go out and strike up a battle with the Qing, but he was beaten back into the city. The Qing began to hack their way through the first layers of the city defenses as the Ming continuously sent relief forces from Xingshan, but all were being ambushed and defeated. Then in April of 1641, the Qing assaulted the outpost of Chaishan. The Qing bombarded it with large cannons and arquebuses. The soldiers and small forces of monks, surprisingly enough, there fought back as best as they could using spears, boulders, and incendiaries. Soon the Qing overwhelmed the outpost with firepower and razed it to the ground. Then in May of 1641, the Ming engaged a Qing force just outside of Xingshan, led by Wu Sangui. Wu's force was outmaneuvered despite having a lot of cavalry, and then he was encircled by the Qing commanders Duo Duo and Xia Halang. The Ming lost a few thousand men, and several commanders fled, only then to get caught up in another engagement around Liangma-shen, just a few miles of Jingzhou. At Liangma-shen, the Ming dug in and tried to bait a force of 3,000 Qing into a fight, but the Qing did not take the bait. More fighting occurred outside various outposts, and the Ming kept driving off Qing raiders, who in turn would just wait until nighttime to hit walls with siege ladders. Songshan resisted a 37-day-long siege under heavy Qing fire until a Ming relief force finally arrived. The Qing were camped just a few miles due east of Songshan and had to fend off multiple Ming strikes against them. It seemed all the outposts and major walled cities were managing to hold off the Qing. The Qing strategy of bombarding them and trying to draw them out into decisive battles in the field was not working. It seemed the Ming still enjoyed the edge when it came to firepower. But Ming scouts were sending concerning reports that the Qing were busy building a ton of weapon carts and ships at Shenyang. It was clear that a purely defensive war would not be enough. The Ming commanders began to analyze the situation, and they discussed the importance of trying to force a decisive battle that might allow them to retake Liaodong. They believed if they could dictate the place and style of combat, then they might stand a chance. The Ming also began to get reports that Korean ships were transporting Qing soldiers in the Bohai Gulf, which raised the concern that Qing might sever their sea supply lines. This all accumulated into a major war planning session in April of 1641. The Ming commanders held a conference at Ningyuan and decided they needed to break the Qing encirclement of Songshan and Jingzhou. Wu Sangui would lead an initial attack, followed up by Zhu Dashao from Jingzhou. They ended up clashing with a Qing cavalry force of 8,000, sending the Qing fleeing with their superior cannons. The battle was embarrassing for the Qing, and the commander of the force, Xia Lang, was replaced by Huang's brother, Duo Gwen, from this point on. It was also around this time the rebel armies had captured and killed the 2 Ming princes, and Yang Sichang committed suicide. All of the northeast outposts and cities were demanding further relief forces and supplies, but the Ming Court decided to focus on the increasing rebel problem, and thus the northeast would just have to rely on what they had. In the summer of 1641, Huang renewed the efforts against Jizhou and Songshan. The Ching erected their siege weapons, dug moats and trenches around the cities to thwart any relief or supply efforts, and dispatched mobile forces to hit anyone outside the walls. Chongzhen did not want to send any significant forces against the Qing, believing by autumn the Qing would become weakened through the War of Attrition. The emperor did not agree with the plan, however, and he sent the Minister of War, Chen Xingjia, and Zhang Erqi to goad Chongzhen into action. The exact same factionalism that had plagued the Ming for decades was soon going to force a catastrophe. Meanwhile, since the death of Yang Sichang, the rebel leader, Li Zicheng's ambitions were growing each day. He was now recognized as a charismatic leader and quite the military genius. The way in which he dealt with Prince Fu had gained him a lot of notoriety with the populace since he was handling out money and food. Li then gained the attention of some gentry, one notable one named Li Yan. Li Yan joined Li and advised him, "You must take capturing the hearts of all the people under heaven as the root. If you don't kill the people, then you'll win their hearts." This seems to have had a profound effect on Li, as he began to do just that. Li also began a program of making popular slogans for his rebel movement. One went like this: "Kill your oxen and sheep, and prepare your wine and spirits. Open your gates and welcome the dashing prince. When the dashing prince comes, you won't be paying taxes." A man after my own heart, and wallet, if I must say. Shortly after, Li Zicheng began changing how his force rebelled. More gentry joined him, such as Yao Jingxing and a midget sorcerer named Song Xiansu. Yes, you heard me right, a midget sorcerer. Song Xiansu was a native of Guid in Hunan province. He walked with a limp because of a bad right foot, and he was known by the locals as Sun the Child. His reputation as a sorcerer came from the fact he went around telling fortunes and casting divinations, which was something seen throughout Chinese history for midgets. Well, one of these fortunes he told was that Li Zicheng would have an 18th grandson who would assume the imperial throne, and that his name would also be Li. So, as Li Zicheng enjoyed popular support and expanded his movement, other rebel leaders continued to rampage throughout western and central China. Widespread famine and more people resorting to cannibalism swelled the rebel armies' ranks. The situation dramatically changed in August of 1641, when Luo Rukai broke off from Jiang Xianzhong and joined up with Li Zicheng in Hunan. Alongside Luo, other small rebel leaders also joined Li, and Li took this newfound force to attack Xintai along the Hunan-Nanjili border. The commander at Xintai was Fu Zhonglong, who managed to beat back the rebels with cannons, but the rebel hordes just kept coming. Fu then sent word to He Renlong and Li Kuoqi, asking the two commanders for help, but both complained it was impossible to cut through the rebel lines to get to Xintai. They began to set up the siege, and Fu's defenders were soon running low on food. It is alleged Fu's forces were forced to eat the corpses of slain rebels. When the gunpowder ran out, Fu had no other choice but to attack the rebels. Fu led 6,000 men out at night to attack the rebels and managed to kill an estimated 1,000 rebels before breaking out of the encirclement. They fled for their lives, being chased by rebel forces, and Fu was eventually captured. The rebels then tried to use Fu to open the gates of Xintai. When he was marched in front of the gate, he screamed out, "I am the commander of Shaanxi, and though I have fallen into rebel hands, and there are rebels on all sides of me, I will never serve you. I am a high official. If you wish to kill me, then kill me. How can I not sacrifice my life rather than help you bandits deceive those in the city?" With all of that said, the rebels beat him to the ground, cut off his nose, and Fu would die from his wounds later. Xintai would fall soon after. Zhou Liangyu would attack Li and Luo's force, driving them off into the direction of Hunan. From there, the rebels would target Nanyang in November of 1641. Nanyang was defended by Meng Ruhu, who died trying to defend the city. When Nanyang fell, Li burnt down the residence of Prince Tang, furthering his personal war against the Ming monarchy. After this, Li began to occupy towns in southwestern Hunan, much to the dismay of the Ming Court. The Ming Court appointed Sun Chuangting straight out of jail to be the new supreme commander of the three frontiers. By the way, I have not made much mention of it, but so many officials were jailed for failing their jobs, only to later be reappointed to that very same job or another job and taken out of jail. It was very chaotic. At this time, the Ming official Wang Xianyan decided to attack Xiangchang in central Henan, which had recently fallen to the rebels. Wang led 10,000 well-trained troops to take the city and found it relatively undefended. Little did he know, the rebels had moved on early. Unfortunately, once the rebels heard of Wang taking Xiangchang, they soon returned and surrounded the city. Wang, along with many of his men, would be killed in street fighting over the city. Zhang Xianzhong made an assault on Shucheng in southwestern Nanjili in March of 1642, which fell quite easily after just a 3-day siege. Zhang then changed the city's name to Dusheng, meaning attained victory. Over the next few months, Li Zicheng and Luch Chung continued to raise hell in Henan. The rebel forces were rotting the Ming dynasty to its core. I would like to take this time to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, if you're still hungry for some more Chinese history after all that, why don't you give my personal channel a look over at the Pacific War channel at YouTube, where I have content dedicated to the Opium Wars of the 1800s all the way to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. The Ming dynasty was like a roast beef, rotting from the inside while being carved up from the outside. Droughts, famines, and terrible administration led to so many starving and war-torn peasants to join rebel groups, and now Li Zicheng emerged the largest rebel leader amongst others, who now held entire armies at their command. Yang Zicheng began the disastrous 10-sided net plan, which resulted in many victories over the rebels, but at a terrible cost. The more the Ming allocated resources towards quelling the rebels in the northwest and the center of China, the weaker their northeastern frontier became, ripe for the plucking for Huang Taiji. Now Huang focused his attention on long-term sieges of major Ming-held fortresses outside the Great Walls, but once those fell, he could attack China proper.